Good evening from New York. Sick of Democrats accusing them of having nothing to improve the economy but ideas from the Bush era, Republicans are planning to introduce instead a bold new initiative from the Gingrich era. Our fifth story tonight, it's called the Balanced Budget Amendment, but its real objective is to protect the rich from tax cuts. And without those tax cuts, Republicans will not tell us how they would balance the budget, even if they do give us a few hints, as you'll see. It was Republican Senator Jim DeMint telling the newspaper The Hill that when Congress returns after the August recess, he and his colleagues, including John McCain and Lindsey Graham, will introduce a resolution to amend the U.S. Constitution. The Balanced Budget Amendment, also pushed by then Speaker Newt Gingrich as part of the 1994 contract with America, would prevent the federal government from spending more than it takes in. But, and there's the rub, it also has a clause barring any tax increases without a two-thirds vote in each chamber of Congress. Gingrich failed to pass it. President Clinton raised taxes, balanced the budget, created 22 million jobs. How would Republicans balance the budget, considering that they're currently pushing to renew $700 billion worth of Bush tax cuts for the rich? House Republican leader Boehner refused to say, despite a prolonged attempt by David Gregory yesterday on Meet the Press to get him to do so. We now join that attempt, already in progress.
You're not being responsive to a specific point, which is how can you be for cutting the deficit and also cutting taxes as well when they're not paid for?
Listen, you can't raise taxes in the middle of a weak economy.
But do you agree that tax cuts cannot be paid for?
Without a help.
But tax cuts are not paid for. Is that correct?
I am not for raising taxes on the American people in a soft economy.
That's not the question, Leader Boehner. The question is, are tax cuts paid for or not?
Listen, what you're trying to do is get into this Washington game, and they're funny accounting over there.
So do you believe tax cuts pay for themselves or not?
I do believe that we've got to get more money in the hands of small businesses.
For more, see Mr. Carlson Runs for Office, the episode from WKRP in Cincinnati. With former Bush Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill now having joined the chorus, the former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan and others who say let those tax cuts expire. Even House Republican Conference Chair Mike Pence admitted that he gets why Republicans might have a credibility problem here.
Congressman, you're asking Americans to believe that Republicans will have spending discipline when you're saying extend the tax cuts that aren't paid for and cut the deficit. How is that a consistent, credible message?
Well, I understand the credibility problem.
But in fact, Republicans are tipping their hand somewhat about where they would get the money to pay for more tax cuts from the rich, take it from the middle class, and make Americans work longer before they can retire. Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty, a Republican favorite for president, suggests redeploying money from the stimulus, which includes tax cuts for the least rich 95% of the country. Boehner ultimately suggested to David Gregory that once the tax cuts for the rich are in place, then he'll pay for them by making everyone else work until they're 70, especially the people in the tanning industry.
One of the ways you talk about getting your arms around the spending was something that you suggested back in June, and that is that Social Security, the retirement age ought to be raised to the age of 70. Is that something that the GOP will campaign on in the fall?
Well, David, I think it's time for the American people to have an adult conversation about the problems that we face.
And so you favor raising the retirement age?
David, there are a lot of options about how you solve these, but I don't want to get the cart before the horse.
Little wonder that in Bush's backyard today, literally just a few miles away, President Obama was raising money for Democrats by slamming Bush Republican economic policies. This after Politico reported on Friday night that the Republican National Committee has its own economic problems, that Michael Steele gave his party bad news at their summer meeting last week, that the RNC will only give its congressional campaign committees $4 million this year compared to the last midterm elections of 2006 when it gave them $57 million. Some of the math of the economy in a moment. First, the politics. Let's turn to MSNBC political analyst Howard Fineman, also senior Washington correspondent and political columnist for Newsweek magazine. Howard, good evening.
Hi, Keith.
Politically, at some point, does the GOP have to reconcile its supposed desire for deficit cutting with what is obviously a more genuine desire for cutting taxes for rich people?
Well, they're going to square that circle rhetorically. That's why they're going to be for a balanced budget constitutional amendment, which they know either won't pass the Congress, which it won't, or won't pass public muster, which it won't. It's a wonderful rhetorical device. while meantime they run away from deficit reduction. This goes way back, Keith, to when in the days of Newt Gingrich and even before him to the late Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan, they said, you know, committing to deficit's an issue is something that's a loser. Let the Democrats have it. And the fact is, over the last 30 years, it's under Democratic presidencies that budgets have come close to being balanced. It's under Republican presidencies that deficits have gone wild, under Ronald Reagan, under George W. Bush, to take two examples.
Howard, one thing in this entire process seems to have been lost already. The Republicans didn't manage to maintain the debate that they wanted, which was to extend all tax cuts. And instead, they're in the middle of a perpetual debate the last few weeks over whether to extend the tax cuts for the rich. Have they lost the definitional battle?
For the time being, yes, but that doesn't prevent some Democrats in the Senate that I talked to, including some of the leadership, from being wary of a long debate in the Senate about taxes. Because the fact is, as a basic principle, most Americans love the idea of having their taxes cut. They like that a whole lot more than they like, as people, to focus on the hard reality of debt and the deficit. That's just a plain fact. And the Democrats have a history on the spending side that, rhetorically at least, they feel they need to defend. So Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, wants to have a short and sharp debate that will stay focused on that issue, but he's afraid of having weeks on end on the Senate floor because it could get out of hand and put the Democrats back on the defensive.
What was Mike Pence doing, admitting the Republicans might have a credibility problem on any issue? Has he been thrown out of the party today and we just didn't get the memo?
Well, he's from Indiana, and you know, they still believe in the idea of balancing budgets there to some extent. Mitch McConnell, the governor, goes way back to the non-supply side tradition of the Republican Party, which preceded Reagan and Kemp and Gingrich. And, you know, they like balanced budgets out there. And Pence, to some extent, I think, was tripped up in his own history and his own roots in Indiana. Otherwise, he would have been completely with the program.
Somebody in Indiana just passed out. Mitch Daniels. You mentioned Mitch McConnell as the governor of Indiana, so I just wanted.
Oh, I did? Yes. I'm sorry. I meant Mitch Daniels.
I'm sure Mitch Daniels passed out, too. If Mr. Greenspan says the tax cuts won't pay for themselves,
right.
and now we have this from Paul O'Neill, what's the best answer Republicans have for paying them? Is it cutting middle-class taxes or making Americans work until they're 70 or 85?
Well, they're not going to have one, Keith. What they're going to do is the mumbo-jumbo of the balanced budget amendment, which is, you know, don't worry, we're going to put it in law, and eventually we'll balance the budget. And they're going to try to force the Democrats to vote against it. And a lot of Democrats will vote against it because it's not good policy, constitutionally or otherwise. They're going to advocate it, hoping like heck that the Democrats will oppose it.
So you've got one side that won't promise to balance the budget, but has historically tried to, as opposed to the other side that promises to balance the budget and won't.
You got it. You just summarized the fiscal politics of the last 30 years.
Do I get a degree for that?
You do.
Thank you very much. MSNBC political analyst Howard Feinman, also of Newsweek magazine. As always, Howard, great thanks.
Thanks, Keith.
Now let's